Long before Hollywood developed a conscience, it was quietly showing the world exactly how to lose one. The subject here is the pre-code period, that raw, ungoverned window in cinema history wedged between the arrival of sound and the enforcement of censorship, a time when studios threw everything onto the screen: sexuality, brutality, moral rot, and criminal behavior without a moment of hesitation. For most modern viewers, these films register as fascinating relics, artifacts of a time when nobody was watching The Watchmen. But for a certain kind of person sitting in those dim, smoky auditoriums 90 years ago, these pictures were not entertainment. They were instruction. This is the countdown of the 10 pre-code films that went beyond mirroring the disorder of their age. Pictures that actively, verifiably, pushed real people toward real crimes. A few of these accounts will leave you unsettled. Others will genuinely disturb you. Every single one will change the way you look at a movie screen. Which title do you believe caused the greatest harm? Keep watching, because the film at number 1 will fundamentally shift the way you understand the relationship between cinema and the criminal mind. Starting at number 10, Possessed, from 1931. Joan Crawford delivered something genuinely electric in this picture. Her character Marion is a factory worker from a nothing town who engineers her ascent into money and privilege through sheer force of personality, seduction, and social ruthlessness. Marion never asked anyone's permission, never acknowledged a boundary, and never once expressed regret for a single maneuver she made. Viewers couldn't take their eyes off her. Female audiences in particular were riveted. This was a woman who looked at Depression-era America's rigged system and made a deliberate choice to cheat it rather than lose honestly. The difficulty was that a meaningful portion of the audience never registered the film's cautionary framing. Not long after Possessed completed its national rollout, law enforcement in no fewer than 3 large American cities began recording a strange new category of fraud complaint. Young women, polished, well-spoken, impeccably presented, were being taken into custody for sophisticated social cons, embedding themselves in affluent households through false identities, accepting loans they had no intention of repaying, and in a pair of confirmed cases, fraudulently signing the names of men they had drawn into romantic entanglements. During one interrogation in Pittsburgh, a suspect described Crawford's portrayal with an almost academic precision, telling investigators she had attended the film 4 separate times and studied closely how Marion managed men who made the mistake of underestimating her. A brief but pointed phrase, "Crawford girls," appeared in newspaper coverage of the period. Department stores across Chicago and New York quietly instructed floor staff to pay closer attention to well-dressed women browsing alone. The film had not handed anyone a blueprint for armed robbery. What it had done was considerably more subtle and, some would argue, more dangerous. It had dressed calculated deception in the language of liberation and made the long con look like self-determination. Marion finishes the film wealthier and freer than when she started. For a certain type of dreamer, that ending carried a very specific kind of weight. At number 9. Safe in Hell, 1931. This one almost never appears on canonical pre-code lists, and that absence is precisely what earns it a place here. The film follows a woman evading a murder charge by fleeing to a Caribbean island governed by no extradition agreement, a place where the machinery of justice simply cannot reach. At its core, the picture is a sustained romantic argument for the existence of spaces that exist entirely beyond legal consequence, and for the idea that a sufficiently resourceful person can locate and inhabit those spaces. That argument resonated far more dangerously than the studio could have anticipated. Within 12 months of the film's release, federal investigators began tracking a measurable increase in what they internally classified as jurisdictional flight. Fugitives who had conducted genuine research into extradition law, identified authentic legal gaps, and deliberately relocated to territories in Mexico, Cuba, and Central America. A particularly audacious case centered on an embezzler from St. Louis who had hosted a private screening of the film weeks before absconding with $60,000 belonging to his employer. Authorities located him roughly 2 years later in a small coastal town in Mexico, living comfortably and entirely insulated from prosecution. At the extradition proceedings that eventually followed, when pressed on where the idea had originated, he reportedly offered a calm smile and remarked that he had been fortunate in his research materials. The film had done precisely what the finest escapist cinema does. it furnished its audience with a geography of freedom. For the overwhelming majority of people in those theater seats, that geography remained a fantasy. For a determined few, it became a working plan. Number 8 is The Easiest Way, from 1931. Constance Bennett inhabits a woman caught at the intersection of poverty and moral compromise, who selects the latter with such composure and refinement that the film's supposed moral condemnation reads, across long stretches of its runtime, more like endorsement than warning. The picture operates as a sophisticated showcase for a particular kind of feminine calculation, wrapped in just enough moral packaging to pass the censors. What emerged in the film's aftermath was less a surge in street crime than a documented rise in what period law enforcement described, with some delicacy, as social fraud. Blackmail involving romantic deception climbed in multiple urban centers. One tabloid-friendly case out of New York involved a woman who had been simultaneously managing relationships with 4 separate wealthy married men, leveraging the threat of exposure against each while carefully maintaining the illusion of exclusivity with all of them. When the architecture of the scheme finally collapsed and she faced charges, investigators found in her apartment a private journal documenting both her techniques and her cinematic influences. The Easiest Way appeared 3 times by name in that journal. Her legal counsel, in a display of considerable nerve, advanced the argument that Hollywood bore a share of moral responsibility for her actions. The presiding judge dismissed that argument without ceremony, but the press sustained the story for several weeks regardless. The film had made high-level exploitation appear frictionless. For an individual already drawn in that direction, frictionless is indistinguishable from an open invitation. 7th on the list, Blonde Venus, 1932. Marlene Dietrich portrays a devoted wife and mother who, to save a dying husband, enters first the nightclub world and eventually prostitution, and who manages, against all narrative logic, to emerge from that descent looking more radiant and composed than any character in that situation has any right to appear. The picture generated controversy through obvious channels, but its measurable damage in the real world arrived from a more particular and unexpected direction. The film rendered in notable detail the mechanics by which a woman might navigate a succession of wealthy male benefactors, sustaining each relationship through plausible emotional performance while quietly drawing financial support from multiple sources simultaneously. It was, reduced to its essence, a depiction of the patient romantic con reframed as dignified survival. In 1933, a Los Angeles investigator named Howard Briggs compiled an internal case summary connecting a minimum of 6 separate fraud investigations to a pattern he labeled the Dietrich method: women who had adopted virtually identical approaches to romantic deception, cycling between patrons with a measured, unhurried strategic calm that registered on screen as something resembling grace. One of those cases involved a woman who had been receiving quiet financial support from 3 different men across nearly 2 years, none of them aware the others existed, until a chance encounter caused the entire arrangement to unravel. When officers went through her room, they found a promotional photograph of Dietrich from the film's lobby display fixed to the wall above her mirror. She offered investigators a single sentence of explanation. Dietrich had demonstrated to her that it was achievable. Dietrich herself, when the subject of the film's influence was raised in later years, reportedly produced only a long, measured smile and offered nothing further. At number 6, The Story of Temple Drake, 1933. Drawing from William Faulkner's incendiary novel Sanctuary, this film pressed so close to the outer edge of what audiences and regulators could absorb that it effectively served as an announcement, through sheer force of transgression, that the Hays Code was coming. The picture confronts abduction, assault, and moral deterioration with a directness that reportedly left even experienced censors visibly shaken. The kidnapping dimension is where the film's real-world footprint became most visible. In the months following the picture's release, investigators across 3 southern states began logging a series of abduction incidents distinguished by an unusual degree of premeditation, victims held as instruments of leverage rather than for immediate monetary demand, the perpetrators displaying a degree of patience and structural planning that law enforcement found genuinely striking. One county sheriff in Tennessee, speaking to a regional journalist, stated plainly that whoever had organized the crimes had invested serious thought into how an abduction could be conducted and sustained without triggering immediate physical escalation. A suspect later arrested in connection with one of those cases possessed a heavily annotated copy of Faulkner's novel and had attended the film on 2 occasions. The film's central contribution was to depict abduction not as an act of impulse and chaos but as a cold, methodical undertaking. And in doing so, it achieved an instructional quality that the literary source, for all its artistic ambition, had never quite managed to produce. The shift from page to screen, it turns out, can make a significant difference in how a lesson lands. Number 5, Hell's Highway, 1932. Well before I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang brought the brutality of convict labor into the national consciousness, Hell's Highway was already placing those same realities before general audiences with unflinching candor, and then taking an additional step that its more celebrated successor did not, by depicting in sequential scene-by-scene detail the precise mechanics by which a coordinated prison escape could be planned, carried out, and survived. The film did not dress escape in romantic clothing. It treated escape as a practical problem and then proceeded to work through the solution. Within a few months of the picture's distribution, 3 separate correctional facilities across the American South reported breakouts that bore structural similarities to what the film had depicted on screen. At one Georgia institution, 7 inmates executed an escape built around a diversionary action, the exploitation of a gap in guard rotation schedules, and coordination with a prearranged contact outside the walls, a level of operational planning that investigators described as methodical and deliberate. The ringleader, when interviewed by prison officials, denied any familiarity with the film. 2 of the men who had followed him out of that facility offered no such denial. One stated with quiet simplicity that the picture had clarified for him that everything depended on timing. The institution's superintendent composed a formal written complaint addressed to the film's distribution company. It was never acknowledged. The picture was quietly withdrawn from circulation in a handful of states in the period that followed, but by that point the lesson had already been absorbed by audiences in theaters throughout the country, by anyone who had been sitting in those seats and paying the right kind of attention. At number 4, Babyface, 1933. Barbara Stanwyck. A steelworker's daughter who transforms her sexuality into a precision instrument, advancing with a methodical focus of a strategic chess player through a Manhattan office tower, floor by floor, until she arrives at the summit wearing an expression of cold and entirely unashamed satisfaction. Babyface is routinely identified as the most scandalous production the pre-code era generated, and the designation holds up. The film does not penalize its central character for her decisions. It does not even particularly invite her to feel uncertain about them. Lily Powers moves through the picture calculating, unsentimental, and largely triumphant. The consequences arrived fast and spread wide. Regulatory boards in New York, Ohio, and Pennsylvania required the studio to make cuts. Municipal authorities in several cities prohibited the film from screening at all. And a pattern of fraud, manipulation, and workplace coercion began surfacing in police records in a form that investigators found genuinely difficult to classify. A Chicago case documented a young woman who had passed through 5 separate employers across an 18-month window, departing each engagement with a substantial financial settlement and a signed confidentiality agreement. When the full picture of her activity came into focus and she was brought in for questioning, the detectives who interviewed her noted that she was measured, purposeful, and showed no indication of remorse. She had attended Babyface twice in its opening week of release. She reportedly told the officer conducting the interview that Stanwyck had grasped something that most women were too conditioned by fear to acknowledge out loud. The film provided reformers with their most compelling single piece of evidence in the campaign for censorship. What those reformers consistently declined to address was the more uncomfortable truth, that Lily Powers had made her entire method appear not merely possible, but entirely logical. Third on the list, Scarface, 1932. No accounting of this subject is credible without Scarface, and no version of the story can be told with any integrity without confronting the sheer force with which this film detonated into the social fabric. Howard Hawks and Howard Hughes assembled something that functioned less as a conventional crime picture and more as a fever dream of uncontained ambition, Paul Muni's Tony Camonte moving through Prohibition-era Chicago behind a machine gun, fueled by a death wish and a personal magnetism so overpowering that audiences found themselves unable to disengage even at the moments when revulsion would have been the rational response. The wave of imitation that followed was swift, widespread, and extensively documented. Robbery rates climbed in the cities where the film circulated. Arrested suspects were found to have been reciting Camonte's dialogue at their victims. A robbery crew operating in New Jersey adopted the film's signature aesthetic, white carnations against pinstriped fabric, as a deliberate and recognizable criminal style. Officers in Chicago noted that discharge incidents in the city's most volatile neighborhoods seemed to intensify on the evenings when Scarface was playing at nearby theaters. Recruiters for criminal organizations in at least 2 metropolitan areas were observed using private screenings as an orientation mechanism for new members, presenting Camonte's arc as a model rather than as a cautionary illustration. The film's recurring X symbol, deployed in the narrative to foreshadow each death, migrated into street usage as a territorial marking shorthand. Legislative efforts to remove the picture from circulation were launched in several cities, succeeding in some and failing in others. But in every location where Scarface ran without interference, it sent audiences back into the street carrying a slightly more consolidated conviction that the rules governing ordinary people simply did not apply to them. Number 2. The Public Enemy, 1931. The image of James Cagney grinding a grapefruit into Mae Clarke's face across a breakfast table has replicated itself through 90 years of film culture as one of cinema's defining expressions of casual domestic contempt. But that image, as arresting as it remains, was not the element that produced the most serious damage. The damage came from the texture of everything surrounding it. The particular way Tommy Powers treats legal authority as a minor personal annoyance, the way a life of crime in this film comes packaged with well-cut clothing and disposable cash and a velocity that makes honest existence appear, by direct comparison, genuinely contemptible. Cagney did not construct a villain. He built a portrait of a man who had examined the losing end of the American economic arrangement and made a calm, rational decision to opt out of it entirely. The impact on audiences was vivid, and for police departments it was severe. Within weeks of the film opening in New York and Philadelphia, juvenile arrest records showed a consistent behavioral pattern. Suspects reproducing Cagney's physical mannerisms, his posture in confrontation, the particular quality of contemptuous composure he projected under pressure. 2 teenagers from Brooklyn robbed a corner grocery and were apprehended largely because they halted their getaway to argue over which of them had earned the right to deliver Cagney's line, "I ain't so tough." A gang in Philadelphia that was targeting illicit drinking establishments dressed in deliberate imitation of the film's wardrobe and reportedly announced each robbery by reciting a line of dialogue from the picture as a kind of professional signature. When Cagney made a publicity visit to a correctional facility for juveniles in New Jersey, the institution's director reportedly drew him aside and informed him, in a tone that contained something other than admiration, that approximately half the residents regarded him as a personal exemplar. The Public Enemy had accomplished something that almost no American film produced before it had been able to achieve. It had engineered an audience's complete identification with a criminal to such a degree that for a measurable segment of that audience, the identification never fully dissolved. And at number 1, Little Caesar, 1931. This is the origin point. Before Scarface. Before the Public Enemy. Before the cascading waves of imitation and the legislative alarm and the broad cultural panic that came to define the pre-code era's collision with lived reality, there was Little Caesar. Edward G.